Israel and, by extension, the Jewish world have become torn-apart societies. Political divisions have been on the rise for years. The gap between the right and left has grown in politics and on the streets, and the share of Israelis and Jews who interact with people from the opposing side has plummeted. Studies effectively tell us that the right and the left both say that the other party's electorates are hypocritical, selfish, and closed-minded, and they are unwilling to socialize across party lines. Many Israelis and Jews read news or get information only from sources that align with their political beliefs, which exacerbates fundamental disagreements not just about policies, but about basic facts, and even about Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian saga. So-called affective polarization, in which citizens are more motivated by who they oppose, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu, secular Jews, religious Jews, than who they support, has dramatically increased in Israel and the Jewish world. Hatred increasingly defines Israeli and Jewish politics and is becoming the greatest strain to the Jewish state and the Jewish world's fundamental cohesion since ever. One might reasonably expect that Judaism would be a unifying, healing force in society. After all, the Talmud states, all Jews are guarantors for one another. Even if this goal has always been unattainable, at least it used to be aspirational. Yet mainly, different Zionist and Jewish movements have for decades exacerbated our divisions, fueled hatred and grievances, and turned fellow citizens into enemies rather than collaborators and friends. This is not true of all Zionists and Jews, of course. The movements comprise millions of Israelis, Jews, and others, many of them good and gracious people who seek to be good doers, bridge builders, and peacemakers, including in the political realm. They are horrified by the political idolatry we are witnessing, and the antipathy and rage that emanate from it. But it is fair to say that these movements, which were at one time defined by their Zionist and Jewish commitments, are now largely defined by their partisan ones. During much of the 20th century, many Zionists and Jews on all sides were disengaged from politics. Kibbutz members, for instance, yearned to farm the land and live a simple socialist life, while ultra-Orthodox Jews desired Torah study. War after war also gave many Zionists and Jews another reason to keep their distance from politics. They needed to defend ourselves against violent neighbors in existential wars, which increased social cohesion and defined what became Israeli unity, resilience, optimism, and hope. The world was irredeemably harsh for Jews, so the Jews had to make do with our one and only Jewish state. In the last 20 years or so, as Israel has not had to fight any true existential wars, prior to October 7th, leftist Zionists claim the right is fascist, whereas right-wing Zionists contend that leftists are traitors. The current alliance between the religious right and Benjamin Netanyahu, a non-religious, thrice-married man who cheated on at least 2 of his wives and is standing trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, seemed incongruous, and in some ways it is. After all, for years religious Jews insisted that good character was essential in political leaders, and especially in prime ministers. But once Netanyahu's Likud party won the 2023 legislative election, many religious Jews fell into line behind Netanyahu. In doing so, they embraced a man whose personal and political ethics are compromised and corrupt. For religious Jewish leaders, and for those representing the movement, character no longer counted. The argument is commonly made that this was pragmatic. Religious Jews might not admire Netanyahu, but he would deliver on their policy agenda, and that mattered most. This might have been true for some, but a good deal more was going on as well. So how might those of us who deeply care about Judaism and Zionism, regardless of where we fall on the political spectrum, help redeem this moment? Most fundamentally, it will require a reshaping of sensibilities, a fundamental rethinking of the how of politics. First, Zionists need to reacquaint themselves with political Zionism's early history, not Zionism of the right or the left. The real political Zionism demonstrated a profound and justifiable mistrust of Jewish safety and security in the diaspora, and did not encourage Jews to become involved in political movements of any kind. The most meaningful emblem of Zionism is not the Knesset, but the land, which applies to both religious and leftist Zionists, as in the biblical land of Israel, and working and preserving the land, respectively. Early Zionists did not hand out voter guides. What they did do was financially acquire the Jews' indigenous lands in Ottoman-era and British-era Palestine, cultivate them, and then create community-driven groups and social networks, much like the very first Jews. That is how a tiny and obscure movement known as Judaism became such a dominant faith in Western civilization, even as our actual numbers remain minimal. That is how Judaism transformed the ancient world and the course of human history. This does not mean that Jews and Jewish institutions should never under any circumstances be involved in politics, because politics has profound human consequences. It is one arena in which to pursue justice, which matters. What this does mean is that Jews need to assume a much different posture, to move away from hyper-partisanship toward a more detached and, dare I say, prophetic role, and to take more seriously than many do the idea of dual citizenship, the belief that we may be citizens of a country, and we are also citizens of the Jewish people. A proper political theology would prevent Jews and Jewish institutions from becoming pawns in political power games, and the Jewish state must be reminded that it is not just another country, but rather the conscience of the Middle East and a light unto the nations. Judaism must be the guide and critic of the state, and democracy its tool that ensures equal rights for all citizens. Second, Israel also needs to develop a theory of political and social engagement that is far more comprehensive and careful, mature and informed, textured and sophisticated. In this respect, today's Jews have much to learn from our ancestors who laid out and built on principles of social teaching over many centuries. The cornerstones of Jewish social thought are human dignity, identity, covenant, and solidarity, meaning the social obligations we have to one another and with the greater world. Our doctrinal whole requires a broad, consistent view of justice, which, when it is faithfully applied, cuts across the categories and clichés of Jewish and Israeli politics. A third thing that needs to happen is for many politically active Jews and Israelis to move away from a spirit of anger toward understanding, from revenge toward reconciliation, from grievance toward gratitude, and from fear toward trust. I have spent a considerable amount of time with people both on the right and on the left to better understand their worldviews. I have been equally impressed by the generosity on both sides. I wonder, though, why many people devote their lives to helping others, yet this does not translate into their political agenda. How is it that anger and aggression have become the public face of both the right and the left, while the many acts of kindness and charity, and the spirit informing these acts, are kept under a bushel, largely out of public view? Why do people on both the right and the left consistently show their worst side rather than their most graceful one? It is a culture of grace that can transform people's hearts, and in the process renew not just Israel, but also the Jewish people and Jewish politics. But a culture of grace does not mean Jews and Israelis should fail to criticize what deserves criticism or stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. Jews are not called to be passive in the face of injustice and maliciousness. The fourth thing that Jews and Israelis can do to strengthen our public witness and the state of our politics is internalize and act on the lessons of, to borrow from our Christian friends, the parable, the Good Samaritan, which speaks to this moment in a powerful way. In the story, a Samaritan comes across a Jew who has been beaten, robbed, and left dying on the side of a dangerous road from Jerusalem to Jericho. After a priest and a Levite both ignore the wounded man, the Samaritan rescues him, and at his own expense nurses him back to health. "Go and do likewise," uttered Jesus. At the time, Samaritans and Jews despised each other and had few dealings, a first-century version of the political, ethnic, and religious tribalism we know too well. The point that Jesus, a Jew, was driving home is that we need to break down the walls between us. We are called to love our neighbors, a category which, according to the parable, includes those who are politically, religiously, ethnically, culturally, and socioeconomically different than we are, and to help them in their need in the most practical way, materially and physically. Instead, too many of us view the other. For some, that means other Israelis, other Jews, or other non-Jews, with a combination of suspicion and contempt that is eating away at our sense of unity. Israelis and Jews can model what it means to reach across the divides that exist in their work settings, in synagogues, in social circles, and on social media. We can demonstrate tolerance and understanding toward those with different life experiences and worldviews. We can be intentional about finding volunteer settings that put them in contact with people who have different political views, backgrounds, religious practices, and socioeconomic status. There is no magic wand we can wave to repair the breach. A nation's civic and political culture is changed by what we do in our daily lives, in our homes, schools, communities, workplaces, and places of worship. And by loving our neighbors, we take the most important first step. That is what Abraham and Sarah called their followers to do, and what membership in the 21st century Jewish people demands. In the end, I doubt whether any one of us will have much to say about our political convictions, but I am quite sure that we will have something to say about how we loved our neighbors, literally and proverbially, even when some of us think that we know it all. Political convictions that lead toward redemption and reconciliation are most likely headed in the right direction. This is not a prescription for a particular kind of political involvement. It is certainly not a roadmap for dealing with complicated public issues. It is, however, a reflection of how Israelis and Jews should engage, both socially and politically. Successful 21st century Zionist and Jewish political social movements will require making the case for social order and moral excellence with generosity of spirit, while offering a healing touch to those who are suffering and living in the shadows of society. Politics can be a more noble enterprise when it is twinned with Judaism, but only Judaism properly understood and properly executed. Such a faith would be guided by the wisdom. Judaism that ends in lovelessness cannot be Judaism.